We may cuddle teddy bears at night, but in the wild, real bears are anything but cuddly. These powerful predators rank among the most dangerous animals on Earth. Every year, countless people fall victim to their ferocious attacks. Today, we're diving into the most terrifying bear attacks ever recorded, proving that these creatures are far deadlier than they seem. On the evening of May 4th, 2021, the dense forest of Waiparous Creek, northwest of Calgary, Alberta, were alive with the quiet stirrings of dusk. The scent of pine and damp earth lingered in the crisp mountain air, carried by a faint breeze that rustled through the boreal canopy. The last light of the sun cast golden streaks across the rugged terrain, illuminating the Ghost River Valley below. The steady trickle of water against the rocks provided a rhythmic backdrop to the wilderness, a sharp contrast to the deepening silence that settled over the trees. As night crept in, the forest seemed almost unnaturally still, an unsettling quiet broken only by the distant rustling of unseen movement in the underbrush. This was grizzly country. Dr. David Lertzman, a 59-year-old assistant professor at the University of Calgary's Ascanier School of Business, had spent his life studying and respecting the natural world. He was a dedicated environmentalist, known for his deep understanding of wilderness survival, indigenous knowledge, and sustainable development. His passion extended beyond academia. He led week-long retreats in the Kanaskaski's backcountry, guiding students through the rugged terrain to teach them how to navigate, meditate, and find their place within the environment. His work was more than just a profession, it was a calling. David and his wife Sarah Lertzman had built a life surrounded by nature in Waiparous Creek, where the wilderness began just beyond their doorstep. His daily trail runs through the nearby Ghost River Trail system were a sacred routine. Moments of solitude where he could move through the landscape he cherished, soaking in the sights and sounds of Alberta's untamed beauty. But the wilderness, no matter how familiar, is never without risk. And on this night, something was waiting for him in the shadows, watching, listening, moving ever closer. Grizzly bears are the undisputed apex predators of North America's wilderness, their power unmatched in the ecosystems they dominate. Weighing between 400 and 1,000 pounds and standing up to 9 feet tall, these monstrous creatures command their territory with instinct-driven precision. Though primarily omnivorous, feeding on berries, roots, and small mammals, grizzlies are territorial animals, aggressive when defending cubs or food sources. Unlike black bears, grizzlies do not flee or climb trees when threatened. They hold their ground, charge, and if necessary, attack. Their bite force, nearly 1,200 pounds per square inch, can crush bone with ease, and their claws, reaching up to 4 inches long, make them lethal in close combat. Most encounters between humans and grizzlies end without conflict. The bears retreat, the hikers move on. But sometimes a single misstep can turn a peaceful moment into a deadly confrontation. At 6 p.m., David left home for his evening run, choosing the Moss Trail, a rugged mountain path with steep inclines and dense forest, winding through the boreal wilderness of Waiparous. The familiar rhythm of his footsteps echoed along the dirt trail as he ascended toward a high embankment, where the land plunged sharply into a vast, rugged wilderness. The sheer drop stretched hundreds of feet below him, the trees at the base appearing as tiny, swaying specks in the fading light. He slowed as he reached the edge, wiping the sweat from his brow and peering down at the dizzying height that made the world beneath him seem impossibly distant. Far below, the twinkling lights of Calgary flickered like scattered stars, a faint reminder of the world he had momentarily left behind. But something else was there. A female grizzly bear, possibly with a cub nearby, had been feeding just beyond the embankment. She had heard him before he had even reached the clearing. The sound of his footfalls, the scent of sweat in the breeze, it was enough to trigger her instinct to defend. Unlike most bears that retreat at human presence, this one did not run. She remained still, crouched in the brush, muscles tense beneath her thick fur. Then, in a flash of movement, she charged. David never saw her coming. The impact hit him from behind with immense force, sending him plunging forward off the embankment. His feet slipped on the loose dirt, arms flailing as he pitched over the edge, the world spinning violently around him. With the bear remaining on the trail above, David tumbled 900 feet down the rocky slope, his body colliding with jagged rock, fallen trees, and sheer cliffside before landing near the Ghost River below. He had no chance to recover, no chance to fight back. By the time he reached the bottom, he was gone. Back at home, Sarah paced anxiously. David was never late. His runs typically lasted an hour at most, but now 4 had passed. Around 10 p.m., she called his phone, but there was no answer. Something was wrong. Grabbing a flashlight, she left the house alone, retracing the route she knew so well. The forest loomed around her, impossibly dark and silent. She called his name, her voice swallowed by the night. Unbeknownst to her, she was standing on the cliff above him, searching desperately for a man who was already gone. By midnight, she called Cochrane Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Within 2 hours, a full-scale search was launched. A helicopter with a spotlight, search dogs, and rescue teams combed the area, retracing his likely path. Just after 2 a.m., the light from the helicopter illuminated the lifeless body below. David had fallen nearly 900 feet, suffering instantaneous fatal injuries on impact. An autopsy later confirmed what officials already suspected. He had not been mauled or consumed. This was not a predatory attack. The bear had reacted out of defense, a split-second act of territorial aggression that had sent him to his death. Wildlife officers immediately set baited traps along the trail, hoping to locate the bear responsible, but weeks passed with no sign of her. Eventually, to prevent attracting other large predators, the traps were removed, and the trail was reopened to the public. The University of Calgary community was devastated. Dr. Jim DeWall, dean of the Haas-Gagné School of Business, described David as a friend to all, a spiritual leader, and an inspiration to thousands of students. His legacy was one of environmental stewardship, deep respect for Indigenous knowledge, and a lifelong dedication to sustainability. On May 6, 2021, the university lowered its flag in his honor. For Sarah, the grief was impossible to accept. She had been so close, calling his name in the darkness, unaware that he had already taken his last breath. She had searched the trails, not knowing she had stood above the place where he had fallen. The knowledge would stay with her forever. David spent his life teaching others how to connect with nature, how to respect it, understand it, and move within it safely. But in the end, it was nature that took him. It was a chilled Saturday morning in Chateau, Montana. The clock had just struck 8, and the overcast sky stretched endlessly, laden with thick gray clouds. Chateau's green landscapes, renowned for their wildlife and agricultural history, now lay veiled beneath the snow and mist of early October. The temperature hovered near freezing, and the biting wind carried with it the weight of an impending storm. Visibility was limited to about 15 feet, with every breath forming a fleeting cloud in the icy air. In this unforgiving weather, 26-year-old Chase Delwo and his older brother Shane, 30, prepared for the day's hunt. Raised on a family ranch in Blackleaf, they were no strangers to the challenges of big game hunting. Armed with their preferred bows, the brothers ventured westward to the rugged terrain near Bynum, determined to bring down an elk. The area, a haven for wildlife, was home to creatures like mule deer, moose, wolves, and the formidable grizzly bear. This wealth of biodiversity also made it a prime hunting ground. Shane, experienced and meticulous, had devised a plan that split their efforts. He climbed a ridge to gain a vantage point overlooking a creek bed, while Chase worked below, intent on driving the elk herd toward his brother. Though their strategy was sound, the worsening weather posed an undeniable challenge. As Chase moved along the creek bed, the snowfall thickened and a frigid rain began to fall. His boots crunched against the sodden grass, the sound muffled by the relentless storm. Despite the conditions, Chase remained determined, his thoughts focused on the prospect of a successful hunt. Suddenly, a distant sound broke through the droning rhythm of the falling snow, the bugle of a bull elk. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of their quarry. Chase froze, straining to pinpoint the direction. The snow and rain muddled his senses, but his instincts urged him onward. The terrain became more rugged, the soft grass giving way to uneven rocky ground. As Chase advanced, he caught a scent on the wind, sharp and musky. It stirred a distant memory, sending a chill down his spine. He paused, scanning the limited horizon. The feeling of being watched crept over him, and his grip on the bow tightened. Without warning, the silence shattered. A massive grizzly bear erupted from the underbrush, its roar reverberating through the creek bed. The bear stood on its hind legs, towering over Chase at nearly 10 feet tall, its dense fur matted with moisture. Its black eyes locked onto him with an intensity that froze him in place. Before Chase could react, the bear charged, slamming into him with tremendous force. His bow flew from his grasp as he was driven to the ground. The bear's jaws clamped onto Chase's skull, its teeth piercing through flesh and bone. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline surged through him, sharpening his focus. The bear released him momentarily, its guttural roar a terrifying proclamation of dominance. Pinned beneath the creature's massive paws, Chase's survival instincts took over. He recalled a technique he had read about years ago. An animal's gag reflex could be triggered by targeting the soft palate. As the bear lunged again, Chase thrust his arm into its throat with all the strength he could muster. The bear recoiled, coughing and gagging, its confusion granting Chase a fleeting chance. Bleeding and battered, he scrambled to his feet, each step a desperate push toward the ridge where Shane waited. His boots slipped on the wet, uneven ground, but he pushed forward, his vision blurred by blood and sweat. From his vantage point, Shane spotted Chase's staggering form through the mist and initially mistook it for a signal of triumph. But as his brother drew closer, Shane's stomach sank. Chase's camouflage hunting gear was in tatters, his face a gruesome mask of blood and mud, and his left eye swollen shut. Shane abandoned his position and rushed to meet his brother midway. Chase's injuries were severe. His clothes were soaked, clinging to him in the freezing air, and blood pooled from multiple wounds. Shane quickly applied makeshift bandages to staunch the bleeding and supported Chase as they made their way to the truck. The storm raged around them, snow and rain obscuring their path, but Shane's focus remained unshaken. Each step was accompanied by the squelch of waterlogged boots and the howl of the wind. The drive to Benefice Teton Medical Center in Chateau was a blur of urgency. Shane gripped the wheel tightly, his foot pressed hard against the accelerator. The truck's engine roared as it sped down the empty highway, the tires kicking up slush and mud. The faint smell of burning rubber mixed with the storm's icy bite. Chase drifted in and out of consciousness, his breath shallow and labored. Shane kept speaking to him, urging him to stay awake, his voice strained with worry. By the time they reached the emergency room, Chase was barely responsive. Medical staff acted swiftly, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few hours. The antiseptic smell of the hospital mingled with the lingering odor of blood and rain. After an exhaustive surgery lasting over 5 hours, Chase's body was a patchwork of stitches and bandages. The ordeal had left him scarred but alive. It was June 19, 2017, when Aaron Johnson, 27, was assigned to work at Pogo Mine, located 90 miles east of Fairbanks in the rugged Alaskan wilderness. An experienced field technician with Alaska Biological Research, Aaron had spent years immersed in the outdoors, applying her studies in geology and botany to the wild landscape around her. It was the kind of work she had always dreamed of, a blend of adventure and science. The day had started like any other, with Aaron and her colleague, 38-year-old Ellen Trainer, being dropped off by helicopter to begin their field work. The Pogo Mine, a gold mine with ties to both Japanese and Australian companies, was situated in bear country, an environment where safety precautions were paramount. All employees, including Aaron and Ellen, had undergone bear safety training, learning how to use bear spray effectively and the option to carry rifles into the field. On this day, 6 employees were assigned to various sites, paired for safety, with Aaron and Ellen working together. The duo had been briefed and equipped, aware of the potential dangers but determined to complete their tasks. They were collecting geological samples along a transect, detailed work that required precision. The women crouched low to the ground, documenting the soil structure, vegetation, and pH, absorbed in their task. The forest around them was thick, the sounds of the wilderness humming softly as they worked, unaware of the danger closing in on them. A male black bear, hungry and on the prowl, had been tracking them from a distance. The bear, using the wind to its advantage, had crept closer and closer, its eyes locked on the 2 women. It was only when Aaron and Ellen looked up, their eyes meeting the bear's, that they realized the danger they were in. The predator was no longer hiding. Its immense presence was impossible to ignore. In that moment of realization, the 2 women instinctively reached for their bear spray. But before they could even use it, the bear surged forward with terrifying speed. It covered the distance between them in an instant, its claws raking Aaron's body as it knocked her to the ground. Ellen, desperate to protect her colleague, sprayed the bear in the face. But the bear was undeterred, its aggression only intensifying. Aaron was pinned beneath the bear, helpless as the animal bit and clawed at her, its immense strength rendering her powerless. Ellen continued to spray, shouting, attempting to distract the bear long enough for Aaron to escape. But the bear turned on Ellen, attacking her just as ferociously as it had attacked Aaron. The struggle was brutal, a blur of claws, teeth, and desperate cries for help. Despite their best efforts, the bear seemed impervious to their resistance. It wasn't retreating as most bears would do when confronted with a threat. Instead, it was intent on its attack, its eyes locked on its prey. The 2 women fought back, but the bear's strength and determination were overwhelming. It seemed there was no escape. The bear finally retreated, its hunger momentarily sated. Ellen, dazed and disoriented, managed to call for help over the radio, transmitting a mayday alert. The male pilot of a nearby helicopter, having heard the distress call, quickly altered course. The helicopter, just 5 miles away from the mine, rapidly closed the distance. Ellen lay motionless, barely aware of the whirling blades above as the helicopter descended. The winch was lowered and Ellen was lifted into the air, her body limp and unresponsive. As she was hauled up to safety, the pilot turned the helicopter back toward the mine. Ellen was soon transported by ambulance to the hospital in Fairbanks, but Aaron was nowhere to be seen. The helicopter returned to the site and a Pogo Mine employee was lowered to search for Aaron. He found clear signs of the struggle: blood, scattered equipment, and flattened vegetation, but no trace of Aaron. Determined, he followed a blood trail through the dense forest. After a short distance, he spotted the bear standing over Aaron's body just 30 feet from the last sign of struggle. Without hesitation, the employee raised his rifle and fired, killing the bear. But it was too late. Aaron had succumbed to her injuries. The vibrant young woman who had dedicated her life to the outdoors, who had married her best friend just weeks earlier, was gone. Her death was a devastating loss. not only for her family and friends, but for the entire community. Ellen, severely injured, was transported to the hospital in Fairbanks where she would recover from her injuries, though she would never forget the brutality of the attack. The Department of Fish and Game launched an investigation confirming that this was a predatory bear attack, an extremely rare and deadly occurrence. It was determined that the bear had stalked them for nearly 15 minutes before the attack, slowly closing the gap behind them and using the forest to stay hidden. News of the attack spread quickly and fear began to sweep through the Alaskan communities. The incident was the second fatal bear mauling in the state within the same week. Concerns mounted. Were bears now seeing humans as prey? Were these rare attacks becoming more common? The Alaska Department of Fish and Game issued warnings urging people to carry bear spray and stay vigilant in the wilderness. But the tragic reality was clear. No amount of preparation or safety equipment could guarantee survival in the face of such a determined predator. Erin's death, though part of a rare and deadly pattern, would forever be remembered as a haunting reminder of the dangers lurking in the wild. Erin Johnson's life had been one of passion, adventure, and dedication to the natural world. Her untimely death in the Alaskan wilderness was a sobering reminder of nature's indifference and the unpredictable dangers it holds. On a frigid December morning in 2018, the snow-covered landscape of Ozersk, Russia, lay in deep silence. The forest surrounding the small, remote town was blanketed in white, its towering pines standing motionless against the icy wind. It was the kind of morning that felt timeless, where nature reigned supreme. But on the outskirts of town, this peaceful scene masked the aftermath of a tragedy that would leave the community both horrified and bewildered. Sergei Grigoriev, 41, was a man deeply connected to the wilderness. Born and raised in the rural outskirts of Ozersk, he had spent his life living off the land, hunting for food, and selling furs to make a modest living. To those who knew him, Sergei was a rugged outdoorsman, perfectly suited to his isolated lifestyle. His 2 loyal dogs were his constant companions, joining him on hunting trips or lounging by the fire in his rustic home. But Sergei's most unusual companion was a massive brown bear named Grumbler, a wild predator that he had raised from a cub. Grumbler had come into Sergei's life 4 years earlier after Sergei shot and killed the bear's mother in self-defense. Finding 2 orphaned cubs hiding nearby, Sergei built a makeshift enclosure on his property, caring for them until he could find homes. While 1 cub was adopted, Grumbler remained. Sergei refused to part with the bear after learning potential adopters planned to use it as bait to train hunting dogs. Instead, he kept the animal, believing he could provide it with a better life. For years, Grumbler lived on Sergei's property, initially roaming freely but later confined to a sturdy cage after an incident in which the bear injured one of Sergei's dogs. Despite warnings from neighbors and family, Sergei insisted that Grumbler was harmless as long as proper precautions were taken. However, by 2018, Grumbler had grown into a fully mature brown bear, weighing hundreds of pounds and driven by instincts Sergei could no longer control. That December, Sergei's closest neighbor Dmitry visited for their monthly tea. As they chatted, Dmitry noticed Grumbler pacing restlessly in his cage. He remarked that the bear, like all of its kind, should have been hibernating during the harsh winter months. Instead, Grumbler seemed agitated, pulling at his chains and growling softly. Dmitry warned Sergei, but as always, Sergei dismissed the concerns, confident in his ability to handle the animal. The following morning, Sergei decided to let Grumbler out of the cage to stretch his legs. He believed the bear's agitation was due to lack of movement, and a short walk on a leash would calm him down. Holding the heavy chain that served as the leash, Sergei opened the cage and let Grumbler out into the snowy yard. The bear followed at first, but when the chain tightened, Grumbler began to resist. Straining against the restraint, the animal pulled with such force that the wooden post anchoring the chain creaked ominously. As the post gave way, Sergei grabbed the chain to stop the bear's escape. The sudden resistance enraged Grumbler, who instinctively turned on Sergei. With one massive swipe of his paw, the bear struck Sergei across the chest, shattering his sternum and sending him sprawling into the snow. Sergei, struggling to breathe with his crushed ribcage, was defenseless as the bear charged again. This time, Grumbler's teeth tore into Sergei's head and neck, ending his life in seconds. The commotion brought Sergei's two dogs racing out of the house. Barking and snarling, they tried to protect their owner, but their efforts only drove Grumbler into a greater frenzy. The bear struck one of the dogs with a powerful blow, sending it crashing into the cage. Turning its fury on the second dog, Grumbler attacked with relentless force, leaving the animal lifeless in the snow. When the chaos finally subsided, Grumbler dragged Sergei's body into the yard and began feeding on the remains. For 2 weeks, the bear lingered on the property, guarding what was left of Sergei and occasionally retreating into the woods. It wasn't until Sergei's sister Maria arrived to check on him that the gruesome scene was discovered. Spotting blood in the snow and Grumbler pacing near the remains, Maria fled and called the authorities. Police arrived shortly after and tracked Grumbler into the forest, his massive paw prints leading deep into the snowy wilderness. Armed and on high alert, the officers found the bear hiding among the trees near the property. Grumbler was shot and killed on sight to prevent further attacks, his death marking the end of the tragic chain of events. Inside Sergei's modest home, officers discovered a heartbreaking scene. His surviving dog, emaciated and trembling, had managed to avoid the bear's wrath but was barely clinging to life. Covered in bruises and too weak to stand, the dog was rushed to safety and later taken in by Sergei's sister Maria. She nursed the animal back to health, describing it as the only piece of her brother she had left, and a reminder of her brother's fierce loyalty to his animals, even in the face of danger. On the evening of June 28, 2011, Lana Hollingsworth set out for her usual walk around the Pinetop Country Club, a secluded retreat in northeastern Arizona. The night was warm, the air still, except for a faint breeze rustling the trees. Apart from the distant hum of traffic, the neighborhood was silent. Lana had walked these paths countless times, her dog trotting beside her, a loyal companion on these peaceful evening strolls. The country club, nestled 200 miles northeast of Phoenix near the New Mexico border, was a haven for her and her husband Marv, a place where they could escape the demands of daily life. But that night, something else was moving in the shadows, something watching, something waiting. For those who knew her, Lana was a woman of warmth and generosity. She had spent her life helping others, dedicating her time to community service long after retiring from her career as a loan officer in Gilbert, Arizona. She volunteered with the Gilbert Fire Department, served as a community emergency response team member, taught CPR classes, and even dressed as a hospital clown to bring joy to patients in need. Family and friends described her as someone who could lift the spirits of anyone she met, always ready to offer kindness, encouragement, or a smile. Outside of her volunteer work, she found comfort in simple routines. She and Marv spent much of their time at their vacation home in Pinetop, surrounded by towering pines and crisp mountain air. Evening walks with her dog had become a cherished ritual, a moment of solitude and reflection. The neighborhood had always felt safe, and though black bears occasionally wandered near the country club, they had never been a threat. Typically shy and reclusive, these animals avoided humans, scavenging for food rather than seeking confrontation. Lana had always been aware of their presence but had no reason to fear them. For years, her walks had been peaceful, but on this night, that peace was about to be shattered. As Lana walked along the path near the Sports Village area, she suddenly heard a noise. Her dog, ever alert, began pulling at the leash, barking loudly. Lana paused, scanning the area, trying to identify the source of the disturbance. In the fading light, about 60 yards away, she noticed a shadow move near a dumpster. The sounds of glass bottles clinking and rustling trash became audible. Then, a large figure emerged from the darkness. A 250-pound male black bear scavenging through the trash. The bear, alerted to Lana and her dog's presence, froze for a moment, lifting its broad head as it sniffed the air. Its ears flicked forward, its nostrils flaring as it caught their scent, its dark eyes locking onto them through the dim evening light. Unlike most bears that would have retreated at the sight of a human, this one did not back away. It remained still, its massive body tense, shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The dog barked, straining at its leash, but the bear was unbothered, unfazed by the noise. It lowered its head slightly, muscles coiling beneath its thick fur, assessing the distance between them. Then, without warning, it moved. A single step forward, then another. The heavy sound of its paws hitting the ground broke the stillness. It was closing the distance, not cautiously, but with purpose. A scavenger bear might hesitate, but this one showed no uncertainty, no fear, only hunger. The bear's slow, deliberate approach turned into a charge. Its powerful limbs drove it forward, its movements faster than should have been possible for such a large creature. Lana barely had time to process what was happening before the animal was nearly upon her. She screamed and tried to run, but the bear covered the final yards in seconds, launching itself onto her back. The force of the impact sent her sprawling forward, her hands instinctively breaking her fall as her head slammed against the hard concrete sidewalk. Stunned and disoriented, she barely had a moment to react before she felt the weight of the bear pressing down on her. Its powerful jaws clamped onto the back of her neck, its razor-sharp teeth sinking deep into her flesh as it pinned her to the ground, its claws scraping against the pavement. Lana tried to fight back, her arms instinctively wrapping around her neck to protect herself, but the bear's force was overwhelming. The animal, relentless and predatory, ignored her struggles as it focused on immobilizing its prey. Lana screamed in agony, her desperate cries echoing through the neighborhood. Neighbors heard the commotion and rushed outside. What they saw was a horrific scene. A massive black bear had pinned Lana to the ground, its thick fur covering her body as its claws swiped at her. Several neighbors tried to intervene, rushing to their cars and sounding the horns, hoping the noise would scare the bear away. They shouted and waved their arms, creating enough of a disturbance to force the bear to retreat momentarily. The bear ran up a nearby tree, leaving Lana lying dazed on the ground, covered in blood. Her dog had run away during the chaos, and she could feel the searing pain from the deep rips and tears in her body. As she lay there, barely conscious, she cried out for help. But just as the neighbors thought the danger had passed, the bear scrambled down the tree and charged at Lana again. The bear, still hungry, was focused on its prey. This was no longer a defensive act, it was a predatory attack, and Lana was now fighting for her life. Despite her injuries, she struggled to push the bear away, her arms and hands covered in slashes. Neighbors continued to try to scare the bear away, but it was relentless, returning to Lana 3 times. On the third attempt, one of the neighbors ran directly at the bear, trying to force it off her. The bear, finally spooked by the sudden threat, fled into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of devastation. Lana was airlifted to Scottsdale Healthcare Osborne Medical Center in critical condition. Her husband Marv arrived at the hospital, horrified to find his wife covered in blood, barely clinging to life. He knelt by her side, holding her hands and desperately trying to comfort her. Lana, still conscious but fading, looked into Marv's eyes. Her voice was weak, but the words carried a devastating finality. She told him she loved him, that she wasn't going to make it and pleaded with him to take care of the dog. Doctors worked tirelessly to save her, performing 7 surgeries over the next 7 days. Family and friends gathered, and a fundraiser was set up to help with medical bills as her insurance would not cover the extensive costs. Though Lana showed signs of improvement in the following weeks, her health took a sudden turn for the worse. A bacterial infection, likely from the bear's claws, spread through her body, causing her vital signs to decline. Despite further surgeries and attempts to combat the infection, Lana succumbed to a brain hemorrhage on July 25, 2011. It was August 2002, a warm and pleasant afternoon in the Catskill Mountains in New York. The sun blanketed the dense forest in golden light, casting long shadows between the towering trees. The Schwimmer family, Rachel, Pincus, and their 3 children from Brooklyn, had arrived in Woodbridge, a village nestled in the heart of the Catskills, for their annual summer retreat. They had spent their vacations here for years, enjoying the peacefulness of the area and the beauty of the mountains. Woodbridge, surrounded by 700 acres of wilderness, was a place of tranquility where families could escape the noise and busyness of city life. The area was popular for hiking, cycling, and water sports, though some of the once thriving holiday cottages were now empty or in disrepair. Despite the passage of time, the Schwimmer family had always found comfort in the familiarity of the location. After lunch, Rachel Schwimmer, along with her 2 older children, took a short walk around the grounds, leaving their 5-month-old daughter Esther to nap in her stroller just outside their cottage. The older children, 4-year-old Ben and 2-year-old Sarah, played on the grassy lawn, their laughter ringing through the air as they chased one another. Unknown to Rachel, a young male black bear was nearby. The bear, likely only 2 years old, had become accustomed to the presence of humans. It had roamed the area before, scavenging for scraps of food left behind by vacationers. His presence had gone unnoticed by the family as he ventured closer to the cottages, drawn by the scent of food. The bear's nose twitched as it caught the smell of the young family. Its instincts led it toward the cottages where Esther slept, unaware of the danger that was about to unfold. This peaceful moment would soon be shattered. "Bear!" a voice shouted from one of the neighboring cottages. Rachel froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Bear!" Panic set in as Rachel looked up and saw the bear ambling across the lawn, heading straight toward her cottage. The bear, only about 5 feet tall on its hind legs, was likely more curious than aggressive, drawn by the scent of the baby and the human food left behind. It was a young male, about 155 pounds, likely foraging for food in the area. Its behavior had become more brazen over time, likely due to humans feeding it directly or leaving food scraps around. Now it was approaching the cottage. Rachel immediately grabbed Ben and Sarah, pulling them toward the safety of the cottage. "Get inside!" she yelled, rushing them inside as the bear approached. But as she turned to race back outside for Esther, it was already too late. Rachel's heart stopped as she saw the bear knock Esther from her stroller. The baby's screams echoed across the yard, a piercing sound that chilled Rachel to her core. In one swift movement, the bear lifted Esther into its jaws, shaking her tiny body violently. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she watched, helpless, unable to reach her daughter in time. The bear, its instincts driven by hunger and curiosity, retreated into the woods with Esther still in its mouth. Rachel and several other witnesses, including her husband Pincus, scrambled to follow. Pincus, frantic, ran after the bear, though it swiped at him with its claws, leaving him injured but undeterred. He continued his pursuit, desperate to save his daughter. The bear paused for a moment, standing its ground as rocks and stones rained down on it from nearby onlookers. Amid the chaos of shouts and screams, the bear finally released Esther and fled into the woods. It was a brief moment of hope, but the relief was short-lived. Rachel ran to her baby and sat by her side, clutching her daughter tightly as she tried to calm her cries. A few moments later, Officer Dave Decker arrived, having been called by the witnesses. He was confronted by the harrowing scene, the aftermath of the attack still raw and evident. Together, they wrapped the baby in a blanket, Rachel's hands trembling as she clung to her child. They called for an ambulance, desperately hoping for a miracle. But it was too late. On the way to the hospital, Esther succumbed to her injuries, her young life lost in an instant. By the time the ambulance arrived, the baby's screams had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The weight of the tragedy settled over everyone present, leaving a haunting stillness in its wake. People were in shock, unable to comprehend how something so horrific had occurred in such a peaceful place. The bear, meanwhile, had not ventured far from the site of the attack. It had climbed a tree about 15 feet high, likely seeking refuge from the chaos it had caused. Police officers soon arrived and, upon finding the bear, made the decision to end its life. 5 shots rang out and the bear fell from the tree with a heavy thud. An autopsy was conducted on the bear to understand what might have led to the attack. Rabies and other diseases were ruled out, and it was found that the bear's stomach contained a mixture of woodland vegetation and human food, fruit labels, aluminum foil, and plastic bags. The bear had become accustomed to scavenging for food left behind by humans, and the sweet scent of milk and diapers likely drew it toward the Schwimmer family. Though it hadn't meant to kill Esther, the bear's curiosity had tragically turned fatal. This was the first fatal bear attack in New York in over a decade, and it was an event that stunned both the locals and wildlife experts. The bear, a young male, had not been tagged, indicating it was not a repeat offender. The attack itself was highly unusual, as black bears are generally shy and tend to avoid human contact. Experts speculated that the bear's hunger and the presence of human food in the area had made it bolder, leading to its tragic actions. The people of Woodbridge, already dealing with the shock of the event, found themselves reflecting on the consequences of human actions. The increasing frequency of bear-human encounters was linked to the rising number of bears in the area, many of which had become habituated to human food. As bears lost their fear of people, they became more likely to approach homes and cottages in search of food, which led to dangerous situations. Following Esther's death, calls for stricter bear hunting regulations intensified in nearby states, like New Jersey and Connecticut. Bear populations had been growing rapidly, and with no control measures in place, incidents like the one in Woodbridge had become increasingly likely. As grizzly bears have grown more reliant on human food sources, encounters with people have become more frequent and more dangerous. Some unintentionally offer food while others actively seek interaction, disregarding the risks. It was a crisp, quiet evening along the Mackenzie River in Canada, where Julien Gauthier and his friend Camille Toscani set up camp after another day of paddling. The sound of the river rushing past filled the air, a constant, soothing backdrop to their otherwise still environment. Julien, a musical composer, had come to the wilderness to record the natural sounds that would become the backbone of his next symphony. A piece he had been dreaming about for years, one that would immerse listeners in the sounds of the wild, grizzly bears, seals, and the harsh winds of the Arctic. It was a journey that had taken years of planning. Julien, a composer in residence with the Brittany Symphony Orchestra, had already earned recognition for his previous works, particularly Symphonie Australe, a composition inspired by the icy winds and the calls of penguins and seals. On that fateful day, he and Camille, a biologist and photographer, had set out to record sounds from Julien's homeland, Canada, where the vast wilderness had shaped his early years. The goal was clear: to document the raw, untouched sounds of nature and weave them into his symphony. Their trip along the Mackenzie River was ambitious. Nearly 1,000 miles of rugged terrain, wild waters, and isolation. But it was the perfect place for Julien's next masterpiece. Each day was spent recording, Camille snapping photos of Julien as he worked. By the end of the month-long journey, Julien planned to return to France and create a mini-concert, where Camille's photographs would accompany the music. But what they didn't expect was that the very wilderness that inspired their work would soon become a source of danger. On August 6th, after 5 days of paddling, Julien had posted an update on his social media. The trip, he wrote, had been exhausting but deeply inspiring. He also mentioned the presence of bear activity, an ominous sign that something was stirring in the forest around them. Despite the distant presence of wildlife, they had seen little of human life for days, save for the occasional bear. The mention of these animals seemed like a passing note at the time, a small detail in the grand scheme of their journey, but it would turn out to be a haunting foreshadowing. The night of August 14th was like any other. After a long day on the river, they set up their tents and prepared dinner. They spoke of their plans for the next leg of the trip, laughing and reminiscing about their past adventures. Soon after, the two settled into their separate tents for the night, unaware that they were not alone in the wilderness. As darkness enveloped the campsite, something stirred in the underbrush. The wind had died down and the stillness was broken only by the rushing water of the river and the occasional snap of a twig. A large grizzly bear, its keen sense of smell drawn to the campsite, began to prowl, its massive form moving silently through the trees. With a nose that could pick up a scent from over 60 feet away, the bear honed in on the faint smell of humans. It was drawn to the campsite, where it found nothing but the remnants of food and the presence of two sleeping figures. The bear's instincts were sharp, its curiosity intense. It padded around Julien's tent, sniffing at the canvas, and then, without warning, it tore through the fabric, its claws easily slicing through the thin material. Inside, Julien stirred, but before he could fully comprehend the threat, the bear lunged. The weight of the animal slammed onto Julien, pushing him down into the dirt. He fought, struggling against the overwhelming force, but the bear's jaws found their mark, clamping around his neck with terrifying force. The attack was swift and unrelenting. The grizzly dragged Julien from the tent into the trees, its grip unyielding despite his desperate kicks and punches. Blood blurred his vision as his strength faded, his cries drowned by the roar of the river and the crushing power of the bear's jaws. Julien's body was dragged through the underbrush, leaving a trail of blood behind him as the bear pulled him deeper into the woods. His breath came in ragged gasps, his life slipping away as the weight of the bear pressed him into the earth. In the darkness, Camille slept, unaware that her friend, her traveling companion, was fighting for his life just a few feet away. When the first light of dawn crept into the sky on August 15th, Camille awoke. The sounds of the river and the cold morning air filled her senses, but something felt off. She unzipped her tent and stepped outside, immediately noticing the destruction. Julien's tent had been shredded, its fabric torn apart as if by some monstrous force. Heart-pounding, she called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic set in as she searched frantically, her eyes scanning the campsite for any sign of her friend. Following the trail of blood, Camille soon realized the terrifying truth. Julien was gone. In a daze, Camille ran to a group of nearby travelers who had set up camp for the night. Desperate, she explained the situation, and they quickly activated their emergency beacon. The signal was received by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police at 7:45 a.m., and a search was launched. The isolated location, only accessible by air and water, presented immediate challenges for rescuers. But the search was hindered further by poor weather conditions, delaying the recovery efforts. By the following day, Julien's body was found, his injuries consistent with a grizzly bear attack. The Department of Environment and Natural Resources confirmed that it was likely a grizzly that had taken Julien's life. although no conclusive evidence was released about the specific bear responsible. Despite the rarity of such fatal attacks, 3 had been recorded in the area since 2001. The tragedy was undeniable. In October 2018, the small town of Olonets in Russia's Republic of Karelia became the unlikely setting for a nightmare. Known for its picturesque landscapes and quiet streets, Olonets had never been a place for grand spectacles. But on this particular evening, a traveling circus had arrived, bringing with it the allure of wild animals and daring performances. The Anschlag Circus, a modest troupe from Voronezh, had set up their tent near the town center, promising an evening of family entertainment. What began as an innocent night out for hundreds of locals soon unraveled into chaos, leaving both the audience and performers scarred by what transpired. The tent was crowded that night, its rows of wooden benches filled with families eager for entertainment. Overhead, bright lights cast a glow over the sawdust ring, illuminating the eager faces of children leaning forward in anticipation. Parents chatted and smiled, unaware of the chaos that would soon unfold. Among the evening's star performers was Yashka, a 16-year-old bear who had spent years as the centerpiece of the Anschlag Circus. Known for his size and strength, Yashka had been trained to perform stunts that both amazed and amused. When the bear made his entrance, towering on his hind legs and balancing a small wheelbarrow in his paws, the crowd erupted in applause. Guided by the sharp commands of his handler, Ruslan Solodyuk, Yashka drew delighted cheers, the sight of the hulking creature walking upright both comical and awe-inspiring. Dressed in a bright orange vest for visibility, Solodyuk stayed close to Yashka, offering verbal cues and occasional taps to ensure the bear followed the routine. The act, called Clubfoot and the Garden Wheelbarrow, was a staple of the circus. It involved Yashka pushing the wheelbarrow around the ring, performing small tricks to the delight of the crowd. The bear, despite his size and strength, had been trained to move with surprising precision. His lumbering gait added to the charm of the performance. But as the act continued, Yashka's demeanor began to shift. He slowed, his movements becoming stiff and deliberate. Halfway through the routine, he stopped abruptly, dropping to all fours. Solodyuk hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, barking commands and gesturing for the bear to continue. The audience fell silent, sensing that something was off. Yashka remained motionless, his ears twitching slightly as his body tensed. Yashka suddenly dropped the wheelbarrow and halted in the center of the ring, his massive frame lowering to all fours. For a brief moment, the audience remained quiet, unsure if the pause was part of the act. Then, in a startling move, Yashka leapt at Solodyuk, knocking him off balance. The bear's powerful jaws clamped down on Solodyuk's shoulder, and screams erupted from the crowd as the handler struggled to free himself. Blood began to soak through Solodyuk's orange vest as Yashka bit into his arm and torso, shaking him violently. The audience's confusion turned to panic as parents grabbed their children and fled toward the exits, while circus workers rushed to intervene. Yashka continued the attack, his powerful claws raking across Solodyuk's chest and arms, tearing through his bright vest. The audience's screams mixed with the shouts of circus workers who rushed into the ring, desperate to intervene. One worker, armed with a metal rod, struck Yashka repeatedly in an attempt to free Solodyuk. The bear released his grip momentarily but remained visibly agitated, pacing the ring with short, erratic movements. The absence of barriers separating the audience from the performance area became glaringly apparent as the bear turned his gaze toward the panicked crowd. Parents shielded their children, some frozen in terror, as the hulking animal prowled the ring. Minutes passed as the staff struggled to regain control. Yashka, growling and pacing, refused to back down. A second worker entered the ring with an electric shock device, using it to subdue the bear. The sharp crackle of the device and Yashka's startled roar signaled the end of the chaos. The bear retreated, allowing the staff to pull Solodyuk from the ring. His body was a bloodied mess, his clothes shredded and deep wounds exposed across his torso and arms. Solodyuk was rushed to a nearby hospital where doctors worked to stabilize him. His injuries were severe. Deep puncture wounds to his shoulder and arm, along with extensive lacerations on his chest, but he survived. Witnesses later described his survival as miraculous, given the ferocity of the attack and the sheer power of the bear. Solodyuk himself declined to speak publicly about the incident, his silence leaving many to speculate about the moments leading up to the attack. Yashka's fate, however, was sealed. The bear was euthanized shortly after the incident, a decision that sparked outrage among animal rights activists. Many argued that Yashka's aggression was not an isolated act of violence, but a predictable response to years of confinement, harsh training, and relentless stress. To them, the bear was not inherently dangerous, but a victim of exploitation, forced into a life that suppressed his natural instincts and subjected him to constant strain. The story of Yashka and the Olenets attack quickly spread beyond the small town, amplified by the video footage captured by audience members. The chilling clips showed the moment Yashka turned on his handler, the screams of the crowd, and the frantic efforts of the circus staff to subdue the bear. The videos reignited debates in Russia over the use of wild animals in circuses, with critics pointing to the inherent risks for both humans and animals. Despite the outrage, the Anschlag Circus defended its practices, blaming the attack on audience members who had ignored requests not to use flash photography. Others suggested that Yashka's advanced age and joint pain may have contributed to his uncharacteristic behavior. Regardless of the cause, the incident became a grim reminder of the unpredictable nature of wild animals, even those subjected to years of training. It was a warm, calm evening in the rolling hills of Ohio, where a man named Sam Mazzola made his living from exotic animals. Sam's property, surrounded by dense woods, was home to various wild creatures: bears, tigers, wolves, all living in enclosures or roaming the grounds. To many, Sam was a controversial figure, revered by some for his expertise and loathed by others for his apparent disregard for animal welfare. Born and raised in Ohio, Sam's passion for animals began early. As a child, he developed an interest in collecting and caring for creatures, a hobby that gradually grew into a full-fledged obsession. Over time, Sam's fascination with exotic wildlife led him to accumulate a variety of dangerous animals. Sam's collection included lions, tigers, and bears, dangerous creatures that, despite their raw power, he believed could be tamed and cared for. He often exhibited them at fairs and public events, offering people a chance to get close to the animals. Sam justified his actions by claiming he was educating the public about conservation, but the truth was more complex. He faced numerous allegations of animal cruelty and neglect. The United States Department of Agriculture had cited him multiple times for violating the Animal Welfare Act, including failing to provide adequate veterinary care and proper living conditions. His license was revoked in 2009, and a fine of $21,000 was imposed for the violations. Yet Sam was allowed to continue housing his animals. Despite the controversies, Sam pressed on with his exhibitions. His most famous animal was Bart, a 500-pound black bear. Sam had raised Bart from a cub, and their bond was well known in the community. The bear would stand on its hind legs when Sam approached, eager for the routine feeding. The two seemed inseparable, and Sam often told visitors how much he trusted Bart, despite the whispers of danger surrounding such a powerful creature. But bonds like these can be fragile, especially when outsiders become involved. Brett Condra, a 24-year-old Ohioan, had long been fascinated by animals. His childhood was spent exploring creeks and rivers in northeastern Ohio, discovering fishing sports and learning to respect the wildlife around him. He would often spend his weekends camping and catching bullfrogs with blades of grass, always surrounded by nature. His family supported his love for animals, and by his 20s, Brent sought work that allowed him to stay close to his passion. When Sam offered him a job on his property, Brent ignored his father's warnings about Sam's business practices and the risks of working with wild animals. The opportunity felt like a dream come true, one he couldn't bring himself to resist. On August 19, 2010, Brent was preparing for the evening feeding when tragedy struck. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property. With a bucket of raw meat in hand, Brent approached Bart's 15-foot by 20-foot enclosure. Over the years, Brent had grown confident in handling the animals, particularly Bart, who seemed to recognize him and had always been docile in his presence. As usual, the bear stood up on its hind legs, eagerly awaiting its meal. In the early days, Brent had been nervous around Bart, but over time he believed he had earned the bear's trust. He approached with calm and steady movements, respecting the animal's wild nature. Slowly, he unlocked the door to the enclosure and let Bart out. Feeding Bart outside his cage had become a routine, one the bear had grown accustomed to. Brent, confident in their bond, never imagined how quickly trust could shatter. Without warning, Bart lunged at Brent, grabbing him with powerful claws and slamming him to the ground. The 500-pound bear, normally calm, had transformed into a savage force. Brent had no time to react. Bart's claws raked across his body and its teeth sank into his face, tearing through flesh and bone. Brent struggled to break free, but the bear was too strong. Its claws shredded his chest and arms, while its powerful jaws crushed his hand and shattered his ribs. Blood pooled around him as Bart continued the brutal attack. Sam, who had been preparing other animals for the night, heard the commotion and rushed to the scene. He shouted at Bart, trying to distract the bear long enough to stop the attack. With a fire extinguisher in hand, Sam managed to force Bart back into the cage. But the damage was done. Brent lay bleeding on the ground, his body torn apart by the bear's assault. Sam immediately called 911 and Brent was rushed to Metro Health Medical Center. Despite all efforts, Brent died from his injuries shortly after 1:30 a.m. on August 20th, 2010. The coroner's report confirmed that Brent's cause of death was blunt and sharp force trauma consistent with a bear attack. Sam, in a brief interview, spoke carefully about the incident, declining to provide details, but mentioning that Brent had been Bart's favorite caretaker. He added that while he respected Brent's family's wishes, he believed Brent would not have wanted Bart euthanized. However, Brent's father and ex-wife insisted on the bear's euthanasia, and a veterinarian carried it out. The tragedy didn't end with Brent's death. In 2011, Sam Mazzola was found lifeless in his home, an eerie scene that only deepened the mystery surrounding his life. Sam's body was discovered handcuffed, face down on his waterbed, wearing a leather mask. The autopsy revealed asphyxiation with a bedroom toy lodged in his throat. The circumstances of his death remain unsolved, adding to the strange and unsettling nature of his legacy. On July 7, 1948, the forest of Michigan's Upper Peninsula stretched for miles, thick with towering pines and tangled underbrush, a wilderness largely untouched by time. It was a place where black bears roamed freely, moving like shadows between the trees, always present but rarely a threat. For those who lived on the outskirts of the wild, encounters with these animals were not uncommon, but attacks were almost unheard of. That changed when a starving black bear emerged from the forest and set its sights on a 3-year-old girl. Carol Ann Pomeranke lived with her family in a remote cabin deep in the Marquette National Forest, a place where civilization felt like a distant memory. The Pomerankes had built their lives around the land, adapting to its rhythms and unpredictability. Her father, Howard Pomeranke, worked as a fire observer, spending long hours in a watchtower perched high above the treetops, scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke. His role was vital in a time when wildfires could spread unchecked, threatening the vast wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Howard's job kept him away from home most of the day, leaving his wife Vivian to care for the family and manage the daily demands of life in isolation. She balanced household chores with tending a small garden, preparing food, and ensuring that her two children, Carol Ann and her older brother Alan, learned the values of hard work, caution, and respect for the world around them. Their life was simple but demanding, shaped by the rhythm of the wilderness. Mornings began with the warmth of the kitchen stove, evenings ended with the distant calls of owls, and in between, the forest was a constant presence. The children had the freedom to explore but were always reminded to stay within sight of the cabin. Carol Ann knew the land by sound, the whisper of wind through the pines, the chatter of birds, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. She had learned to recognize the animals that shared their world. Deer slipping through the trees, raccoons scurrying across the porch at night, and the occasional black bear lingering at the edges of the clearing. Black bears were common in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, with a population of around 12,000, but sightings near homes were rare. Typically weighing between 100 and 300 pounds, they were far smaller than their grizzly cousins and far less aggressive, preferring to avoid human contact. The bears had never been a threat to the Pomerankes. They kept their distance, watchful but uninterested in the family. For as long as they had lived there, that unspoken understanding had never been broken. But this year, the forest felt different. Food was scarce, the rivers had run low, berry patches had thinned, and prey had grown harder to find. Black bears, usually timid and predictable, had begun appearing where they hadn't before, near homes, farms, and roads, desperate for anything to eat. Though black bear attacks are rare, they do happen, and when they do, they're often driven by extreme hunger or the bear feeling cornered. Michigan had never recorded a fatal black bear attack, and the animals were known to avoid humans whenever possible. But as the summer wore on, rangers warned that some bears were growing bolder, crossing into new territory, their hunger overriding their fear. A starving bear, its body weakened and its instincts sharpened by desperation, was an unpredictable force. The Pomerankes, like many families, listened to the warnings but never imagined the danger would reach them, until the day it did. The afternoon of July 7th, Vivian sat in the kitchen with a visiting friend, Mrs. Summers, the open door letting in the warm summer air as they talked. Carol Ann played on the wooden porch just a few feet away, her small hands tracing patterns in the dust. The day was peaceful, ordinary, until a single scream shattered the stillness. Vivian shot up from her chair, her heart pounding. It was a short, sharp cry, not the playful sound of a child at play, but one of pure terror. She rushed to the door, her eyes immediately locking on to the scene outside. Carol Ann was on her hands and knees reaching toward the doorway, her face twisted in fear. Behind her, stepping onto the porch, was a black bear. It was thin, its ribs pressing against its dark fur. Its eyes, locked onto the child, were not the cautious eyes of a bear merely passing through. They were the eyes of a predator. It exhaled a deep, guttural growl, muscles tensing beneath its thick coat. Then it attacked. The bear's jaws clamped onto Carol Ann's legs, dragging her from the porch in a single brutal motion. She screamed, clawing at the wooden boards, her tiny hands slipping against the grain. Vivian lunged forward, but Mrs. Summers yanked her back, slamming the door shut in an act of blind survival. The last thing Vivian saw before the door closed was her daughter's outstretched arms, her terrified face disappearing into the tall grass. Outside, the struggle was short. Carol Ann kicked, screamed, fought, but the bear was stronger. It clamped its jaws around her skull, the pressure crushing bone instantly. Her small body went limp as the bear, driven by starvation, dragged her toward the trees. Vivian fought against Mrs. Summers' grip, sobbing as she broke free. She ran for her husband's gun cabinet, her hands shaking as she tore through the drawers, searching for the pistol. But it wasn't there. Howard had taken it with him to the fire tower. She ran back to the door, throwing it open, but the yard was empty. The only sign of what had happened was a trail of blood, smeared across the dirt leading into the woods. Panicked, Vivian ran to the nearest ranger station, barely able to form words. Within minutes, 7 rangers led by Bruce Elliott arrived at the Pomranke cabin, one of them bringing search dogs to track the bear's scent. If there was any chance Carol Ann was still alive, time was running out. The search party spread out following the trail. One of the Labrador retrievers caught a scent almost immediately, leading the men deeper into the forest. About 160 yards from the cabin, they found the first sign, a child's shoe streaked with blood. The men exchanged uneasy glances, realizing what they were likely about to find. Still, they pressed on, the dogs pulling at their leashes. Just 150 feet further, they found her. Carol Ann's small body was slumped against a tree, her legs eaten to the knee. Her abdomen tore open, her intestines stretched across a nearby bush. Her tiny shirt was still intact, slightly rolled up as if she had simply fallen asleep. But the fatal wound was unmistakable. A deep puncture wound near her left eye, a hole so deep it reached her brain. The men stood in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery sinking in. One of the rangers whispered a curse under his breath. There was nothing to be done. Ranger Wayne Weston stayed behind to guard the body while the others continued forward, hoping to track and kill the bear responsible before it could strike again. He stood alone, gripping his rifle, scanning the tree line. Then movement, a rustling in the bushes. Without warning, the black bear charged from the trees, rushing straight for Weston. The ranger raised his pistol and fired 5 shots in rapid succession, the bullets tearing into the bear's chest. It collapsed just feet from where Carol Ann lay. The other rangers, having heard the shots, rushed back to the scene. A quick examination of the bear's stomach confirmed what they already knew. Inside were human remains. The bear had killed the child, fed on her remains, and was returning to finish what it started. Carol Ann Pomranke's body was recovered from the forest and returned to her family, presumably by the rangers involved in the search. Her parents were devastated, struggling to comprehend the brutal loss of their young daughter. Vivian, who had witnessed the attack firsthand, was inconsolable, haunted by the final moment she had seen unfold before her eyes. The bear responsible was taken for further examination to confirm its role in the attack. Authorities determined that the bear had been suffering from extreme starvation, its stomach completely empty aside from the remains of the child. It had not been hunting, it had been desperate. It was May 2005, a typical spring day in Canmore, Canada, where the air was crisp and the mountains looming nearby cast their shadow over the small town. The mornings were cool, the afternoon sun bearing a warmth that was welcomed by hikers and joggers alike. The trails around the golf course, a popular area for both locals and visitors, were busy with those looking to enjoy the scenic beauty of the land. The town was a haven for outdoor enthusiasts, and the serenity was often interrupted only by the occasional sound of a distant mountain biker or the whisper of a hiker's footfall. The grizzly bear, however, had no business in this part of the world. Its presence was unexpected, its wanderings an anomaly. Authorities had relocated the 4-year-old male grizzly bear just days prior. The bear, having been spotted on the golf course several times, hadn't shown aggressive behavior, but its proximity to humans posed a concern. After a close call with a woman on a hiking trail where the bear had charged but ultimately stopped short, Fish and Wildlife officials decided to move it deeper into the wilderness. Normally, relocations were more extensive, at least 50 miles, but given the circumstances, only a 10-mile move was deemed necessary. The authorities, however, would soon regret their decision to take the safer route. Less than a week later, the bear was spotted again on the same golf course. The move had done little to deter it. Whether it was drawn back by familiarity or simple instinct, the bear was determined to return to its new, unwanted home, and it would soon clash with the one person who had no reason to be concerned about an animal she hadn't yet seen. Isabelle Dubé, mother to 5-year-old Lucy, had grown accustomed to the trails that wound around the golf course. As an experienced marathon runner, she'd made use of these trails countless times, training for the races that marked the summer ahead. On this particular morning, she was joined by 2 friends, both of whom were also marathon runners, and together they maintained a steady pace through the soft spring air. Lucy, a lively child, was back home with her father, and Isabelle was relishing the rare opportunity to train without the distractions of motherhood. For the first 40 minutes, the women ran in silence, each focused on their breathing and pace. They had no inkling of the danger that lay just ahead. The bear, unaware of the approaching joggers, crossed the trail directly in their path, forcing Isabelle and her companions to come to an abrupt stop just 40 feet from the animal. The bear, equally startled, froze momentarily before reacting to the sudden presence of the humans. Isabelle's 2 friends were paralyzed with fear, their bodies locked in place as their eyes fixed on the massive creature ahead of them. But Isabelle, her instincts driving her forward, made a split-second decision. She bolted. The flight response was immediate. Isabelle turned left, heading toward the nearest tree, her instinct driving her toward safety. The bear, however, was just as quick to react. It charged after her, its massive body gaining on Isabelle as she scrambled toward the tree. Neither had thought through their next moves. Both were fueled entirely by primal instinct. Isabelle's hands clawed at the rough bark of a ponderosa pine 6 feet to her left, her legs working furiously to lift her body. But the bear was faster. Its enormous paw shot out, striking Isabelle's left ankle with a force that shattered the bone the moment the blow connected. Isabelle crumpled to the forest floor, her body sprawling awkwardly, pain shooting through her as she tried to push herself up. The 2 women who had been with her snapped out of their shock and fled in the opposite direction, knowing that their best chance was to get help and leave Isabelle behind. In their panic, they didn't look back, the knowledge of the bear's power spurring them to run without hesitation. Isabelle was alone now. Her broken ankle rendered her immobile, her body on hands and knees as the grizzly closed in. It pounced once again, its full weight slamming into her back. Isabelle was pinned to the ground, face first in the dirt and leaves, her mouth full of earth as the bear went wild on top of her. It tore into her back with its claws, raking through her flesh with savage force. The sharp, stinging pain of the claws slicing through her skin was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the final strike. With every breath, the air seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating as the grizzly continued its attack. The bear's jaws sank into the back of Isabelle's head, and with one brutal tug, it snapped her neck, ending the ordeal in a horrific instant. The 2 women who had run for help reached the clubhouse barely half a kilometer away, breathless from their sprint. They immediately alerted one of the officers stationed there, and the officer, realizing the gravity of the situation, rushed toward the trail. By the time he arrived at the scene, the bear was still over Isabelle's lifeless body, tearing into it with reckless abandon. The officer, moving cautiously, raised his rifle and fired a single shot. The bear collapsed onto Isabelle's body, its life snuffed out in an instant. The officer and several others struggled to move the bear's massive carcass, which weighed over 600 pounds. And when they finally reached Isabelle, it was too late. Her body, crushed beneath the weight of the grizzly, had been torn apart. Isabelle Dubé's life was over, her body forever lodged in the forest floor. Her broken and torn remains would never cross another finish line. The tragic consequences of the authorities' decision to relocate the bear only 10 miles instead of further into the wilderness would haunt the town of Canmore for years to come. The loss of Isabel, a woman full of life and determination, would forever be a reminder of the fragility of human existence in the face of nature's untamed power. On August 24, 2012, the autumn chill had begun to creep into the vast Alaskan wilderness. In the heart of Denali National Park, where the untamed beauty of North America remained as it had for millennia, Richard White was setting up camp. He had spent decades behind the lens, chasing the fleeting moments of nature's raw elegance. At 49, he had long since abandoned the safety of group hikes, preferring solitude among the towering peaks and sprawling tundras. This land was his cathedral, the place where he felt most alive. But even cathedrals can become tombs, and before the sun would set on his final day, Denali would claim him forever. Photography had not always been his calling. As a teenager in San Diego, he had stumbled upon an old camera at a thrift shop, and from that moment, the world took on an entirely new dimension. The lens became his teacher, drawing him into landscapes he might have never explored otherwise. He never intended to make a living from it. His job at a pharmaceutical company paid the bills, but his passion for photography was what tethered him, giving him something to look forward to amid the monotony of daily life. This trip to Denali was not his first. He had visited 3 times before, drawn back by the vast silence and the chance to capture creatures preparing for the long Alaskan winter. August was perfect, just before the deep snows swallowed the land. The bears, lynxes, moose, and smaller creatures of the tundra were all on the move, desperate to store what they could before the season of scarcity arrived. It was, by all accounts, a photographer's paradise. Upon arriving, Richard wasted no time setting up camp. The drive had been long, and with the sun beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks, he hurriedly pitched his tent, stowing away his supplies. That night, he managed only a few shots of the twilight settling over the tundra, the sky painted in purples and golds. By dawn, he was already deep into the wilderness, camera slung around his neck, backpack filled with snacks and extra batteries. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, and as the first rays of sunlight pierced the treetops, the forest came alive. Squirrels darted between branches, birds took to the skies, and a bull moose waded through a distant marsh. Richard had found his place beside a quiet river where willows hugged the water's edge. It was there, after hours of patience, that he caught sight of something extraordinary: a grizzly bear. A half-ton male lumbered from the tree line, moving with a grace that belied its massive frame. It approached a cluster of berry bushes no more than 60 feet from where Richard sat, plucking the ripe fruit with delicate precision. Richard barely breathed. His fingers worked instinctively, adjusting the focus, snapping frame after frame. A perfect moment in time. A collision of predator and photographer, neither disturbing the other. But as the bear moved, something changed. Richard had always maintained a safe distance from wildlife, trusting that the creatures of Denali would keep theirs as well. But this bear was not turning away, it came closer, 40 feet, then 30. Richard shifted slightly, adjusting his footing. Beneath his foot, a cereal bar wrapper crinkled. The sound broke the stillness. The bear lifted its head, locking eyes with the man behind the lens. Richard froze. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something primal. Slowly, he lifted his camera, snapping one final shot, the bear staring directly into the lens. And then it moved. The impact came like a freight train. Weighing up to 600 pounds, grizzlies can reach speeds of 35 miles per hour in a charge, their sheer mass making escape nearly impossible. Half a ton of muscle and instinct slammed into Richard's back, driving him into the dirt. The first scream tore from his throat as claws raked through his jacket, slicing deep into flesh. The bear did not hesitate. It lifted him, tossing him like a rag doll, his body hitting the earth before he could even comprehend the pain. A swipe to the head split his scalp. With claws measuring up to 4 inches long, capable of ripping through flesh and bone with a single strike, the bear's attack was swift and devastating. Another ripped through his shoulder. His body, strong from years of hiking, was no match for the raw force of the bear's fury. When its jaws clamped down on his neck, the world blinked out. For Richard, it ended quickly. The attack had ended his life nearly immediately. The bear, however, was not finished. It dragged his body through the undergrowth, leaving a crimson trail that stretched for nearly 200 yards. There, in a shallow depression, it covered Richard's remains with dirt and leaves, marking the cache as its own. Hours later, a group of hikers stumbled upon his abandoned backpacking camera, the scene before them something out of a nightmare. They ran the 3 miles to the nearest station, and by nightfall, rangers had deployed helicopters and search teams. They followed the blood. The bear was waiting, pacing near the cache, its breath visible in the cold evening air. When the rangers approached, it did not flee. It stood its ground, teeth bared, muscles tensed. They fired warning shots, but the darkness obscured their aim. The bear vanished into the trees. At sunrise, they returned, spotting 5 separate bears in the area from the air. But one kept circling back to the kill site, unwilling to leave. The rangers moved in, rifles steady. 3 shots rang out. The bear staggered, then collapsed. Richard's final images were never released to the public. But for those who saw them, they told a story of the terrifying power of nature, a reminder that even the most seasoned among us can miscalculate the thin line between awe and danger. Richard White had spent a lifetime capturing the beauty of the wilderness, and in the end, it was that wilderness that took him. It was September 18, 2018, under the starry sky in Quebec, not far from Ottawa. The rural stretch of Highway 148 lay quiet, surrounded by dense woods and open fields. The road marked the transition from one small town to another, the land stretching out on either side. It was a place where nothing ever seemed to happen, a road usually empty with little more than the occasional passing vehicle or the whisper of the wind through the trees. But on this particular night, it would bear witness to a tragedy unlike any other. The Pontiac Sunfire, driven by 2 young men ages 19 and 23, was heading down the road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The driver, a man in his early 20s, kept his focus ahead, his hands steady on the wheel. His friend sat beside him, their voices drifting between them as they casually chatted, unaware of the sudden danger that was about to present itself. The night air felt still, almost too still. Then, without warning, the calm shattered. A massive 300-pound black bear emerged from the trees, stepping directly into the Sunfire's path. It seemed to materialize from the shadows, its dark form nearly invisible against the night until it was too late. The driver reacted instinctively, slamming on the brakes, but the bear was already too close. The car's low-slung design sent the massive animal hurtling into the air with violent force. Its body twisted and flipped before crashing back to the pavement, landing heavily in the path of an oncoming vehicle. The impact jolted the Sunfire violently. It swerved sharply, veering off the highway and into a ditch with a bone-rattling thud. Inside, the 2 men were slammed against their seatbelts but escaped uninjured, the car's frame miraculously holding up against the collision. Dazed but unharmed, they took a moment to gather themselves, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they processed the surreal scene. The road fell silent again, but the stillness was heavy, punctuated only by the sight of the lifeless bear sprawled across the asphalt, its massive 6-foot frame blocking the lane. Yet there was no time to linger. Another vehicle was approaching fast. A Nissan Pathfinder, a large SUV, came into view, traveling in the opposite direction. Inside were a young couple and their friend. The driver, a 25-year-old woman from Ottawa, guided the car along the quiet highway, her boyfriend beside her in the front seat. Their friend, a 40-year-old man, relaxed in the back. The night was serene, the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets the only sounds accompanying their journey. But as they neared the Sunfire, the calm began to unravel. Then, just ahead, a loud crash rang out. The woman's eyes widened as she tried to process the source of the noise. Before she could react, something massive and dark came hurtling toward them as if it had fallen from the sky. It was the bear, propelled by the momentum of its initial collision with the Sunfire. The 300-pound bear smashed through the windshield with the force of a speeding bullet, its body crashing into the interior of the SUV before it was violently ejected out the back window. The destruction was catastrophic. The vehicle came to a halt in the middle of the road, the sound of shattering glass still echoing in the air. The woman, once full of life, was slumped over the steering wheel, her blood staining the seat beneath her. Her boyfriend, still in shock, stared ahead blankly, unable to process what had just happened. His gaze drifted slowly to the back seat where their friend lay, pinned by the twisted wreckage of the vehicle. The man was unrecognizable, his body crushed beneath the mangled frame of the SUV. The impact had claimed both lives instantly, leaving the boyfriend as the sole survivor. The young man sat motionless in the wreckage, his heart pounding as he tried to comprehend the scene unfolding around him. The woman he loved, the woman who had been beside him just moments earlier, was gone in an instant. The man he had called a friend, who had shared countless memories with them, was now lost as well. The shock of it all hit him in waves, but there was no time for grief. His world had shattered completely, leaving only the deafening silence of the night. Minutes later, the first responders arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. The sound of sirens filled the air, but for the young man, everything was already silent. His mind was numb, unable to process what had just happened. The police and paramedics worked around him, but he remained motionless, lost in a haze of disbelief as he stared at the wreckage. The events of that night were soon pieced together. The bear, as it turned out, had been wandering outside its usual territory during the annual mating season, a time when male bears roam in search of females in heat. A local hunting guide had warned drivers in the area to be extra cautious during this time, as such occurrences were more common. Still, no one had anticipated a bear wandering onto Highway 148. Bears were rarely seen in this area, and the chances of such a collision were low. But on that night, it was a strange twist of fate that led to the catastrophic event. The two men in the Pontiac Sunfire had swerved off the road in their attempt to avoid the bear, the car coming to a stop far from the destruction that followed. The bear, with its 6-foot body, had flown through the air, its trajectory leading it directly into the path of the Nissan Pathfinder. The SUV's occupants had been utterly unprepared for the impact, with the bear's weight and force overwhelming the vehicle in a matter of seconds. In the aftermath, the young woman whose life had been cut short in an instant was remembered by those who knew her for her vibrant spirit. Her boyfriend, left behind in the wreckage of their shattered world, was inconsolable, the weight of the loss too much to bear. The 40-year-old friend, another casualty of the bear's violent impact, was mourned by his own family and friends. The emptiness left in the wake of the tragedy was immeasurable, and the scars would remain with the survivors forever. The bear, too, had not survived the crash. Its once powerful body had been torn apart by the collision, leaving its fate intertwined with that of the victims. In the end, the tragic events of that night would be a haunting reminder of the unpredictable dangers of the wild, and how life can change in the blink of an eye. It was a calm, warm morning in Mora, New Mexico, where Adelia Trujillo, at 93 years old, went about her day in her small, tin-roofed house. The day was not unlike any other for the elderly woman whose life had been marked by simplicity and a deep connection to the land. She had never been one for modern conveniences, preferring instead the steady rhythm of a quieter life. Raised with strong values, Adelia was a woman who made sure to share the traditions of her heritage with her family, from cooking meals on her wooden stove to telling her grandchildren the stories of their ancestors. She was a woman who knew her mind, guided by her unwavering faith. But on this particular day, Adelia would encounter something she never expected, something that would change the course of her life forever. It had been a normal morning. Adelia completed her prayers, tidied up her home, and began her daily tasks. There was a soft breeze outside, the type that ruffled the dry desert brush but did little else to disturb the stillness. Adelia wasn't in a rush to go anywhere, but that afternoon she had planned to visit the Senior Citizen Center like she did most days to check on her friends. As she moved about, the peaceful quiet was suddenly shattered. The back door, which she often left ajar to let in the fresh air, was forcefully thrown open. Adelia, startled, rushed to the kitchen, her thoughts racing. She wondered if someone had broken in, perhaps a thief looking for something of value. But when she reached the doorframe, her eyes locked with the last thing she could have imagined: a massive black bear standing in the doorway, blocking her path. The animal's dark eyes blinked in the dim light of the room, its fur matted and unkempt. Adelia froze. The bear was huge, easily weighing over 250 pounds, and it looked just as confused to see her as she was to see it. Standing at nearly 6 feet tall, it towered over the frail woman, who was barely 5 feet 3 inches in height. Her heart pounded in her chest as the fear crept in. She knew that if the bear decided to attack, there would be no chance of her surviving. Adelia's instinct, however, wasn't to remain still. In a panicked moment, she screamed, the sound piercing the air. It was a natural reaction, but a dangerous one. Bears, much like many wild animals, can become aggressive when startled, and her cry only served to escalate the situation. The bear shifted, its ears perked, and without hesitation it charged. Adelia spun around and ran, her frail body struggling to move quickly enough. The house was small, and she knew that running toward the back of the house wouldn't save her. Her only thought was escape, but the bear was much faster. Within moments, it was on her, slamming her to the floor with terrifying strength. The pain came quickly. Adelia was thrown into a helpless struggle as the bear's claws raked through her skin, its teeth sinking into her. She was completely at the mercy of the wild creature that had invaded her home. Fear coursed through her, but her faith remained strong. She whispered to herself, believing that God would watch over her, whatever the outcome. It wasn't long before Adelia's strength began to fade. The bear, in its primal hunger, continued its brutal attack. The damage was severe. Within minutes, the woman who had lived so many years with such vitality was left lifeless in her kitchen. Hours later, Adelia's grandson, Richard Ortega, went to check on her as he often did. Their homes were next to each other, separated only by a short distance. Richard liked to visit his grandmother to make sure she had what she needed, from food to simply companionship. But that afternoon, something felt off. When he arrived at the house, he immediately noticed the disarray. The back door, now wide open, sent a chill down his spine. As he entered the house, his calls for his grandmother went unanswered. He moved quickly through the rooms, a sense of dread growing with every step. When he reached the kitchen, the sight that greeted him left him breathless, his world suddenly falling apart. There on the floor was his grandmother. The large, bruised and bloodied form of Adelia lay in the place where she had spent most of her days, her body disfigured beyond recognition. Richard's heart shattered as he knelt beside her, his tears flowing freely. He immediately called the police, and they arrived shortly after. An investigation was quickly launched, with the bear's location becoming the priority. Adelia's family, while devastated, was determined that the animal be found. The authorities had reason to believe that the bear had been wandering in the area in search of food, likely driven by the unusual scarcity of natural sources. The summer had been harsh, with dry conditions followed by late frosts that had decimated crops. The once plentiful fruit trees in the area were bare, leaving the bear to wander in search of scraps. It didn't take long for the authorities to locate the animal. Just half a mile from Adelia's house, the bear was cornered, its days of wandering and hunger coming to a swift end. It was a 4-year-old male weighing around 250 pounds, just the right size to have overpowered a frail elderly woman. Officials speculated that the bear had lost its fear of humans due to the food scarcity that year. With few natural food sources in the area, it had likely wandered closer to home, searching for anything it could scavenge. The news of Adelia's death spread quickly throughout Mora, with many in the community shocked at the rarity of such an attack. It had been more than a century since a bear had killed someone in the state. Locals had heard of bear sightings, but most encounters were non-threatening. The tragedy marked an end to the peace that had defined Adelia's life. Adelia Trujillo's death was a reminder of the unpredictable dangers that lie hidden in the wilderness, and the fragile balance between humans and the wild creatures that roam the earth. While the tragedy of her passing would forever haunt her family, there was solace in knowing that her faith had remained unshaken until the very end. In the end, though the loss was great, her legacy remained a testament to the strength of a woman who had lived her life on her own terms, regardless of what came her way. On June 22, 1892, the high desert of Chihuahua, Mexico stretched out endlessly under the unrelenting sun. The vast plains and rugged canyons stretched over 100,000 square miles, but were sparsely populated with human settlements few and far between. Among these outposts was Colinia Pacheco, a small Mormon settlement established by families who had fled persecution in the United States. The Neagle family was among them, working tirelessly to establish a foothold in the unforgiving wilderness. Brothers Hiram, 22, and George Neagle, just 18, had been tasked with maintaining one of their family's ranches outside the colony. It was hard, isolating work, but Hiram, the elder of the two, approached it with determination. The brothers were no strangers to the challenges of ranch life, from unpredictable weather to the ever-present threat of predators. They had grown up in these conditions, learning to rely on their wits and each other to survive. Chihuahua's wilderness was home to a host of wildlife, but none posed as great a threat as the Mexican grizzly bear. Towering over 6 feet on its hind legs and weighing up to 600 pounds, the grizzly ruled as the apex predator of the region. Its immense strength, sharp claws, and powerful bite, delivered with 3-inch-long teeth, made it a creature to be feared and respected. By 1892, the grizzly population was already in decline due to overhunting and habitat loss, but in this corner of the desert, they still roamed. The Neagles' troubles began when they noticed their livestock disappearing. Over several weeks, they found the remains of goats and cattle scattered across the property, their carcasses bearing the unmistakable signs of bear attacks. The losses were substantial, and the brothers knew they had to act. One evening, Hiram spotted a massive grizzly near the ranch while returning from the river. It was clear this bear was responsible, and it had grown bold enough to come dangerously close to their home. Determined to protect their ranch, Hiram and George armed themselves with rifles and set out to track the bear. They rode on horseback for miles, following the trail of destruction the predator had left behind. The tracks led them along the Gavilon River and eventually to a canyon flanked by rugged hills. Scattered among the tracks were the remains of livestock, grisly evidence of the bear's rampage. As the brothers pressed on, they decided to split up to increase their chances of spotting the animal. George rode ahead, scanning the rocky terrain for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before he saw it. a hulking brown figure moving in the distance. He shouted for Hiram, and the brothers quickly regrouped. Dismounting their horses, they raised their rifles and took aim. The first volley of gunfire rang out, with Hiram firing several shots into the bear's torso and legs. George aimed for the head but missed. The bear, wounded but still alive, let out a deep bellow of pain and began limping away, retreating into the canyon. Determined to finish the job, the brothers pursued it, pausing only when George's rifle jammed, the cartridge stuck in the chamber. As he worked to fix it, Hiram moved ahead, confident the bear was mortally wounded. Moments later, George heard 3 more gunshots echo through the canyon. Assuming Hiram had fired the final kill shots, George hurried after him. But as he reached the hilltop, he saw no sign of his brother, only the bear's tracks continuing deeper into the canyon. Alarmed, George called out Hiram's name, his voice carrying over the stillness of the desert. No response came. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the bear, still alive, crouched over something on the ground. A sickening realization washed over him as he spotted a torn blue shirt just feet from the animal. His brother was down, and the bear was still alive. The bear, with bloody jaws, had attacked Hiram. George screamed, trying to scare it off. For a moment, the bear retreated, allowing George to rush to his brother's side. Hiram was barely conscious, his body a horrifying mess of injuries. His right hand had been completely severed. Bite marks covered his neck, and his scalp had been peeled back, exposing puncture wounds to his skull. Blood soaked his torso, where deep claw marks had torn through flesh and muscle. Through labored breaths, Hiram managed to recount what had happened. As he approached the bear on foot with his horse, thinking it was dead, the animal suddenly lunged at him. It had been lying in wait, feigning death to ambush its attackers. His horse had bolted, leaving him with no way out. Hiram's frantic attempts to fire his rifle were in vain, as the bear's immense strength overpowered him. It had bitten into his neck and chest, pinning him to the ground. Before George could process the horror of his brother's injuries, he heard movement behind him. The bear was returning. Grabbing his rifle, he aimed as the animal charged. This time, the shot hit its mark, striking the bear in the thigh. The massive creature staggered and tried to climb a tree, but collapsed from its injuries. George approached cautiously, firing one final round into the bear's head to ensure it was dead. With the threat neutralized, George turned his attention back to Hiram. Realizing the urgency of the situation, he fashioned makeshift bandages and a tourniquet to slow the bleeding. Using his hat, he fetched water from the river to clean the wounds. The brothers were 15 miles from the ranch, deep in the wilderness, and the nearest help was much farther away. George knew he had to get Hiram home if there was any chance of saving him. Wrapping Hiram in blankets and securing him on his horse, George began the long and grueling journey back to the ranch. Hiram slipped in and out of consciousness, his strength fading with each passing mile. George walked alongside the horse, urging it forward through the dark, treacherous terrain. The brothers reached the ranch hours later, but Hiram's condition had deteriorated severely. Infection had set in, and without antibiotics, still decades from being discovered, there was little hope. The family decided to take Hiram to a nearby town in a desperate bid to find medical help. Doctors from neighboring areas arrived, doing everything they could to treat his injuries, but their efforts were in vain. Over the next 2 days, the infection spread and Hiram's condition worsened. At 10 p.m. on the night of June 24, 1892, surrounded by his family, Hiram succumbed to his injuries. Hiram's death was a devastating blow to the Neagle family and the tight-knit community of Colonia Pacheco. At just 22 years old, he had displayed remarkable courage and resilience, facing a predator that few could survive. The Mexican grizzly that killed him was one of the last of its kind, a species driven to extinction by 1964. Today, the story of Hiram and George Neagle endures as a harrowing reminder of the dangers faced by settlers in the wilderness. Though the Mexican grizzly is now gone, the canyons and rivers of Chihuahua remain, silent witnesses to a battle that claimed the life of one young man and forever changed the life of another. In May 2011, the rugged wilderness of Alaska's Seaward Peninsula, with its snow-capped peaks, dense forests, and vast untouched landscapes, became the backdrop for a haunting ordeal. The remote region, known for its fierce weather and dangerous wildlife, is home to powerful predators like the grizzly bear, a force of nature in its own right. 54-year-old Wes Perkins, a seasoned outdoorsman and a former fire chief from Nome, Alaska, had spent decades navigating these wild terrains. But on this particular hunt, the wilderness would challenge him in ways he had never imagined, thrusting him into a life-or-death struggle with one of nature's most formidable creatures. Wes was joined by his close friends Dan and Edward Stang for a spring bear hunting trip. The group had tracked a large male grizzly bear across the snow-covered landscape, eager for a successful hunt. They had traveled to the secluded wilderness with snowmobiles, which were essential to covering the vast distances between tracks. The bear they were tracking was massive and had just emerged from hibernation. The men had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but they could have never imagined how their hunt would take a deadly turn. After several hours of following the bear's tracks through the snow, the men reached a point where the trail seemed to vanish. The bear had disappeared and the snow was undisturbed in the area. The trio began to fan out, searching for any clue that would lead them to the elusive predator. Wes, eager to find the bear, ventured further away from the group. He moved ahead, unknowingly stepping closer to the very danger he had been tracking, the weight of his steps unnoticed by the creature watching from the shadows. What Wes didn't know was that the grizzly bear had already spotted the group. The bear, a terrifying predator weighing over 1,000 pounds, was lying in wait, its sharp eyes following every move the hunters made. Grizzly bears are super predators, and this one, hungry after a long hibernation, was ready to strike. Wes had unknowingly ventured too close to its territory, and the bear was ready to defend it. Wes took a few more steps when he suddenly felt the ground tremble. The massive grizzly charged, emerging from its hidden position with terrifying speed. The bear moved faster than Wes could react, and in seconds it was on him. The first blow sent Wes sprawling to the ground, and before he could lift his rifle, the bear grabbed him by the head. The grizzly's powerful jaws closed around Wes's skull, and its claws tore into his body as it began to shake him like a rag doll. The pain was immediate and unbearable. Wes screamed, but the bear's grip was unrelenting. In a flash of horror, Wes realized he was fighting for his life. His companions, hearing the commotion, rushed to help, but what they saw as they approached was a nightmare come to life. The bear's claws and teeth were embedded in Wes's body, and the violent shaking was tearing him apart. Dan and Edward fired their rifles at the bear, trying to stop the attack, but the bear's immense strength made it nearly impossible to land a clean shot. The grizzly continued its assault, unaware of the gunfire around it. The men, desperate to save their friend, continued to fire until one shot landed and finally made the bear release Wes. The grizzly let out a roar of pain before retreating into the dense brush, leaving behind a bloodied Wes lying in the snow. The scene was chaos. Wes's face was unrecognizable, his skull shattered, his jaw broken, and blood pouring from his wounds. His eyes were swollen shut and his breath came in shallow, labored gasps. Dan and Edward, stunned and terrified, rushed to his side with no idea whether he was alive or dead. They knew they had to act quickly, but they were paralyzed by the horror of the situation. Wes, barely conscious, used all of his strength to survive. The pain was immense, but his survival instincts kicked in. He struggled to breathe, each gasp more difficult than the last. His jaw had been torn from his face, his nose was gone, and his skull had been cracked under the force of the bear's attack. But despite everything, Wes fought to stay conscious. Wes struggled to breathe, his body unable to move properly. Blood poured from his wounds and his face was unrecognizable, but he fought to stay conscious, knowing his survival depended on it. Dan and Edward worked to stabilize him as best they could, applying pressure to his wounds and trying to keep him awake. They knew they needed to get help, but they were in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles away from civilization. They radioed for assistance, but the closest rescue teams were hours away. Time was running out for Wes. After what seemed like an eternity, the helicopter arrived to airlift Wes to safety. His friends helped him into the aircraft, and Wes was flown to the nearest hospital, where he was immediately placed into a medically induced coma. He underwent 26 life-saving surgeries over the next several months, the first of which was to reconstruct his shattered face. The doctors used titanium plates to rebuild his jaw, and Wes spent months recovering in the hospital, unable to speak or even eat solid food. The recovery was grueling. Wes's injuries were so severe that he had to relearn many basic functions, including how to speak, eat, and even breathe properly. The damage to his face was permanent, but he fought through the pain, determined to recover. After months of rehabilitation, Wes was finally able to leave the hospital, but his life would never be the same. Wes's survival story is nothing short of miraculous. Despite the horrific injuries he sustained, he continues to live an active life. He has shared his experience with others, warning of the unpredictable dangers that lurk in the wild. Wes's story is a witness of human resilience, showing that even in the face of unimaginable pain, the will to survive can overcome the odds. Though he can no longer hunt as he once did, Wes is not bitter. He holds no ill will toward the bear that nearly took his life. Instead, he speaks with quiet wisdom about the need for respect when interacting with wildlife. The bear did what it had to do to survive, just as Wes did. It was September 27, 2015, a crisp fall morning in the rural outskirts of Kalispell, Montana. The air carried the scent of pine and earth, and the sun, low in the sky, struggled to break through the dense canopy of trees surrounding Barbara Paskey's home. Her house sat on the edge of Flathead National Forest, just a few miles from Ashley Lake, in an area well known for its wildlife, including the many bears that roamed freely through the forest. Barbara, an 85-year-old woman, had lived here for many years. She had come to love the bears that wandered through her yard, and over time, her admiration turned into something more. Every week, she placed sunflower seeds and millet in her backyard, hoping to entice the animals closer. She would watch from her windows, captivated by the majestic creatures that had come to rely on her generosity. Barbara saw herself as a protector of sorts, ensuring that the bears were well fed during the tough months leading up to winter. But what she failed to understand was that by feeding them, she was breaking the law and putting herself, her neighbors, and the bears at great risk. Despite being warned by wildlife authorities, Barbara persisted. She knew the risks, but the idea of seeing the bears so close, watching them feed, brought her a sense of connection to the wild world outside. It wasn't until 2012, after receiving a citation, that she reluctantly acknowledged the danger, though she never truly stopped. Barbara's family suspected that her Alzheimer's disease, diagnosed in 2009, had affected her judgment, causing her to disregard the growing risks. She saw the bears as friends, not threats. But it wasn't until a young black bear, one of the very animals she had nurtured, showed up on her doorstep hungry and desperate that the real consequences of her actions began to unfold. The bear had been accustomed to the food Barbara scattered across her lawn, but on this particular day, Barbara had failed to put out her usual offering. The bear, a young female, was starving and instinctively moved closer to the house, searching for a meal. Driven by hunger, it found an opening, breaking into the house where Barbara had never expected it to go. Inside, Barbara was unaware of the bear's presence as it explored the house, tearing through cabinets and pantry shelves. When Barbara heard the noise in the kitchen, she assumed it was something harmless, a cat or maybe a fallen object. But when she rounded the corner, she froze. The bear was there, huge, disheveled, and ferocious, its dark eyes gleaming with hunger. Barbara had no way of escaping. She was trapped. The bear, trained by months of feeding, didn't hesitate. It charged, knocking Barbara to the ground. The old woman screamed as the bear's jaws snapped inches from her face, its powerful paws pinning her down. She tried to shield herself, curling into a ball, but the bear was relentless. Its claws sliced into her skin, tearing through her shoulders and arms. The attack was swift, brutal. Then, as quickly as it had struck, the bear paused. It stepped off Barbara, climbed onto a work surface, and scrambled out through a window. The chaos of the attack had left Barbara alone, bleeding and in shock. Unable to move, she lay on the floor, the pain surging through her body, and with only one thought: to reach the phone. Minutes dragged on as she struggled to crawl, her body weak and her vision fading. Finally, her fingers brushed the phone, and with trembling hands, she dialed for help. The authorities arrived soon after, but by then, Barbara was barely conscious. The sheriff's department, along with the wildlife response team, arrived at the rural property. They found Barbara severely injured, the house ransacked. Though she was still alive, her chances of survival were slim. Barbara was rushed to Cecil Regional Medical Center in critical condition, but despite her strong will to survive, she passed away just a few days later on October 1st. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. Barbara had been a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Her kindness, her devotion to wildlife, and her friendly demeanor had made her popular among the locals. Now, her absence left a painful void. The investigation into the attack uncovered the truth behind the bear's behavior. It wasn't just an unlucky encounter. It was a result of Barbara's ongoing actions. By feeding the bears, she had conditioned them to expect easy meals, and this had made them dependent on humans. The bear that attacked Barbara had learned that homes could offer sustenance, and now the authorities had a problem. There was a dangerous bear on the loose. The community went on high alert. Wildlife officers set traps and door-to-door warnings were issued. But as the investigation unfolded, officers discovered that Barbara was not the only one feeding the bears. Some of her neighbors, despite knowing the dangers, had continued to offer food to the animals. They believed it was harmless, that they were helping. But now the bears had become a serious threat. 2 young black bears, yearlings, were captured after they wandered into the neighborhood. They were habituated to humans, their stomachs full of sunflower seeds and millet. With heavy hearts, wildlife officers euthanized both of them. It was the only option. These bears, raised to associate people with food, were a danger to the community. If they were released, they would only return, and the cycle of dependency would continue. But the bear responsible for Barbara's death was still at large. The search continued, but after weeks of tracking and setting traps, it was called off. Despite the presence of over 15,000 black bears in Montana, no one had ever heard of a fatal attack by a black bear in Flathead National Forest. It was an isolated and tragic event, one that highlighted the dangers of feeding wild animals, no matter how harmless it may seem at first. While some seek contact knowingly, others, unaware of the risks, still find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a cold, overcast morning in the remote wilderness of Katmai National Park, Alaska, where the natural beauty of the land was interrupted by an uninvited danger. The vast expanse of forest stretched out in every direction, unbroken, save for the footprints of those who ventured into this bear territory. Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend Amy Huguenard had arrived in late September, eager to capture their final moments in the wild before the coming winter. But their arrival just before the bears would begin their hibernation set a dangerous stage for what was to come. Timothy had always felt a pull toward the wilderness. Born in New York in 1957, he grew up in a tumultuous household. He later moved to Long Beach, California for college, where he fell into a destructive party lifestyle and struggled with addiction to cocaine and heroin. By the late 1980s, his drug use spiraled out of control, culminating in his expulsion from college. The turning point came when he overdosed and barely survived, a wake-up call that forced him to face his demons. Seeking a new direction, he found solace in the wilds of Alaska, particularly among the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park. Over the next 13 years, Timothy became increasingly captivated by the park's bears. He earned minor fame as a self-proclaimed bear whisperer and eco-warrior, spending summers recording hours of video footage interacting with the animals. His apparent fearlessness earned him a following, though his lack of professional training left him ill-prepared for the risks he was taking. His belief that the bears saw him as a friend, not a threat, led him to make a critical mistake. He chose to forego bear spray, relying instead on his perceived rapport with the creatures, a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. The pair had flown into the park with Willie Fulton, a local pilot, to observe the brown bears that Timothy had studied for years. Their timing, however, was risky. Arriving just before hibernation meant food would soon be scarce, leaving the bears hungry, aggressive, and more prone to seeing humans as easy targets. Their plan was to capture the bears' final moments before winter, but this timing mistake would put them in harm's way. As they tracked a few bears, Timothy quickly realized that most of the ones he had previously studied had already entered hibernation. The remaining bears were unfamiliar, and though a sense of unease lingered in the air, he decided to stay and set up camp with Amy. On October 5th, they began preparing their camera for footage. The setup was nearly done. The camera was on, recording audio, but the lens cap remained, ensuring no visuals were captured. Outside, the soft sound of rain pattered as Amy adjusted the equipment inside the tent. After a while, Amy called up to Timothy, asking if he was still out there, as she hadn't heard him in a while. Then the first scream broke the silence. Timothy's voice screamed for Amy to get out of the tent and run, as a 28-year-old male bear attacked him. Amy rushed to open the tent, shouting for Timothy to play dead, hoping it would make the bear lose interest. For a moment, the bear seemed to retreat, and Timothy's voice could be heard asking if the danger had passed. It was a brief respite, but the bear returned quickly, more aggressive than before. Timothy's screams grew louder and more desperate as the bear returned, its teeth sinking deeper into his flesh. In his panic, he begged Amy to hit the bear, pleading for her to do something. She grabbed a frying pan and swung it at the bear, striking its head. The bear released its grip on Timothy's head but quickly latched onto his thigh, dragging him away from Amy. Blood covered Timothy, and with the realization that he had no chance of survival, he shouted at Amy to run to save herself. He knew the attack was fatal. Unlike many other victims of bear attacks, Timothy didn't slip into shock. He remained fully aware as he was torn apart by the very creature he had once revered. The bear made little noise aside from the occasional growl. The only sounds that broke the silence were Timothy's screams and the dull thud of his body being dragged across the dirt. Amy, frozen in fear and shock, didn't leave. Terrified by what she had just witnessed, she remained helpless. She wasn't familiar with the area, having come to the park only because of Timothy, and had no way of finding her way back to civilization. On the recording, her scream pierces the air, a raw, desperate cry as the horrifying reality set in. But her screams only drew the bear back, and Amy too was mauled to death by the same animal. The next morning, air taxi pilot Willie Fulton arrived at Kaflia Lake, where he was supposed to pick up the couple. Spotting what looked like Timothy waving a tarp in the distance, Willie called out but received no response. Concerned, he decided to hike up the path toward the campsite to investigate. As he walked the trail, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of activity or movement. Uneasy but finding no immediate cause for alarm, Willie turned back toward his plane. Just as he reached it, a sudden chill ran down his spine. About 20 feet away, a large brown bear stood, watching him silently from the brush. Willie climbed into his plane, heart pounding, and started the engine, hoping the noise would scare off the bear. Circling above the campsite, he scanned the area and froze. Below, the bear was feeding on something. As he focused, his stomach dropped. He could see the remains of a human rib cage in the bear's jaws. Hastily, Willie called the park rangers, guiding them to the site. As they approached, they encountered a few bears along the path but didn't feel threatened. However, when they neared the camp, one ranger spotted a bear just 20 feet away, its proximity raising immediate concern. It wasn't intimidated. It stood its ground, unafraid of their presence. The rangers immediately opened fire, discharging 21 rounds before the bear finally fell. The rangers continued to the camp, where they found 2 collapsed tents and signs of a struggle. The entrance to Amy's tent was partially buried in mud. When they cleared the mud, they found her body almost unrecognizable, buried as though the bear had planned to leave her there for the winter. Her body appeared to be peacefully resting, but the gruesome truth was evident. She had been nearly consumed. They moved on, searching for Timothy. His remains were scattered in the nearby woods. His head, still attached to part of his spine, bore a grimace of pain. His right arm and hand were found not far away, the watch still strapped to his wrist. The scene was gruesome, and the rangers worked quickly to recover what was left. As they continued searching, a smaller bear, no older than 3 years old, stalked them from about 30 feet away. It made its intentions clear, edging closer as if to attack. The rangers quickly shot it, not willing to take any chances after the previous horrors. Once the bodies were removed from the site, the rangers sent the larger bear's remains for a necropsy. The results confirmed that it had consumed human remains, including clothing, confirming it was the bear responsible for Timothy and Amy's deaths. On the crisp morning of September 16, 2011, the forest straddling the Montana-Idaho border seemed timeless. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp soil and pine needles. Sunlight filtered softly through the towering trees, painting the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was serene, almost unnervingly so. The only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. Beneath this peaceful veneer, however, lay the potential for danger. For 39-year-old Steve Stevenson, this was the wilderness he cherished. A devoted husband and father of 2 daughters aged 14 and 10, Steve was the embodiment of dedication. During the work week, he labored as a miner with Highcraft Mining, extracting silver and gold from the earth, but his weekends belonged to the outdoors. A seasoned hunter and hiker, Steve was deeply connected to the land. Those who knew him spoke of his warmth and selflessness. He often took younger or less experienced hunters under his wing, eager to share his passion for nature. This trip was meant to be an escape from the routine, a chance to enjoy camaraderie and the thrill of the hunt. Joining him was 20-year-old Ty Bell, a fellow hunter and friend from their hometown of Winnemucca, Nevada. The 2 men had joined a larger group of hunters, each with valid permits to pursue black bears in the region. The rugged terrain offered ample opportunities for their quarry, but it also held risks. This was grizzly country, home to one of the most powerful and unpredictable predators in North America. Grizzlies, though protected under federal law, had been the subject of overhunting for decades, reducing their population to critically low levels by the mid-20th century. Thanks to conservation efforts, their numbers had slowly recovered, but sightings remained rare. Hunters were required to take bear identification courses to distinguish between black bears and their larger cousins. However, in the dense, shadowy forest, identifying a bear in the split second before firing could be nearly impossible. By mid-morning, the group had ventured several miles into the wilderness near the Idaho-Montana state line, deep within a rugged backcountry area known as Scout Ridge. The area was known for its challenging terrain, steep ridges, thick underbrush, and dense forest that limited visibility to just a few feet in places. Its remote location made it an area few ventured into without preparation. Even for experienced hunters like Stephen Ty, the isolation meant that help was hours away if anything went wrong. Still, Stephen Ty, eager to increase their chances of success, decided to split off from the main group. It was a strategy they had employed before: cover more ground, then regroup at the end of the day. The terrain was challenging, with dense forest and patches of huckleberries, known to attract both black bears and the rarer grizzlies that inhabited the area. As they climbed a ridge to scout the area, their conversation was light, tinged with the anticipation of a successful hunt. The ridge offered a sweeping view of the valley below, its dense canopy stretching into the horizon. Both men, being experienced hunters, had discussed their plans before they split off from the group. If they encountered a grizzly, they agreed they would retreat and try again another day, knowing that grizzlies were larger, more aggressive, and far more dangerous than the black bears they were permitted to hunt. This wasn't an idle precaution. Earlier in the day, they had seen signs of grizzlies in the area, claw marks on trees and overturned logs where the bears foraged for insects. These were clear indicators that they weren't alone in the forest. It was Ty who first spotted movement. A flash of dark fur against the underbrush caught his attention. The bear moved low to the ground, likely foraging for berries or roots. Ty raised his rifle, steadying his aim through the scope. In the fleeting moment, he was confident it was a black bear, a legal target. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle rang through the trees, and the bear staggered before bolting into the thick woods. The two men waited as protocol dictated. 15 minutes passed in tense silence. A wounded animal was the most dangerous kind, its instincts sharpened by fear and pain. Hunters in Montana are strongly advised to exercise caution when approaching wounded wildlife, as animals that are not fully deceased can become highly unpredictable and dangerous. While there is no specific law mandating a waiting period after a shot, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Park emphasizes the importance of allowing enough time for an animal to succumb to its injuries before following a blood trail. Despite their experience, Stephen Ty decided to follow the blood trail after just 15 minutes, unknowingly placing themselves in a perilous position. The dense forest limited visibility and concealed the grizzlies' movements. The trail led them into denser, darker parts of the woods, where sunlight barely penetrated. The stillness around them felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. What they didn't know was that their target wasn't a black bear at all. It was a grizzly, one of only 45 known to dwell in the Cabinet Yaak ecosystem. At an estimated 400 pounds, it was smaller than some of its kind, but still a powerful predator. Grizzlies are known for their aggression when threatened, and this one had been provoked. The trail suddenly ended in a thicket of trees. Steve and Ty heard it before they saw it, the low, guttural sound of a bear's growl, followed by the unmistakable crunch of twigs underfoot. Then, from the shadows, the grizzly emerged. It was battered but alive, its deep-set eyes locking onto the hunters. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then the bear charged. The men reacted instantly, raising their rifles and firing. The shots rang out, but the grizzly didn't falter. Fueled by adrenaline and rage, it barreled forward. Steve, seeing the bear was fixated on Ty, made a split-second decision. Shouting and waving his arms, he positioned himself between the bear and his younger companion. It was a selfless act, one that spoke to Steve's character. The bear's attention shifted. It lunged at Steve, knocking him to the ground. Ty, now frantic, fired shot after shot at the animal. The grizzly's powerful jaws clamped down on Steve's leg, and its claws tore through his flesh. Steve fought back with every ounce of strength he had, but the bear's weight was overwhelming. Ty's hands trembled as he reloaded his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. In the chaos, one of Ty's shots struck Steve in the chest. It's unclear whether the bullet ricocheted off the bear or hit Steve directly, but the result was devastating. Moments later, the bear collapsed from its wounds, its massive body slumping lifelessly beside Steve. Ty rushed to his friend's side, assessing his injuries. Steve lay motionless, blood pooling around him. Amidst the claw wounds and deep lacerations, Ty noticed a gunshot wound to the chest. The realization set in. One of his own bullets had struck Steve during the attack. With the other members of their hunting party far off and unaware of the situation, Ty made a desperate call to emergency services, his voice shaking as he relayed their location. The remote nature of the forest posed significant challenges for the rescue team. Ty stayed with Steve until help arrived, scanning the silent forest around him with his rifle close at hand, unsure if other predators might approach. Hours passed before a helicopter finally reached Scout Ridge. Steve's body was airlifted from the scene and taken to Lincoln County authorities. An autopsy later confirmed that while the bear's attack had inflicted severe injuries, it was the gunshot wound that had ultimately caused Steve's death. The grizzly was taken to a lab in Bozeman for examination, where wildlife officials confirmed it was a male, estimated to be 6 to 8 years old. Its death became another dark reminder of the fine line between human activity and the unpredictable forces of nature in these shared landscapes. For Ty Bell, the tragedy was a heavy burden to bear. Though no charges were filed against him, authorities ruled the incident an accident. He was haunted by the knowledge that his actions, however unintentional, had taken his friend's life. The emotional toll was immense, a weight he would carry for the rest of his days. Nestled in the eastern reaches of India lies Odisha, a land where ancient forests meet modern civilization. For centuries, these dense jungles have harbored secrets and dangers, their paths walked by both holy men seeking enlightenment and predators seeking prey. Here, in the dense woodlands of the Nabarangpur district, humans and wildlife maintain an uneasy coexistence, one that would be shattered on a warm evening in May 2018. The Kumar family lived in a modest two-room house on the outskirts of Nabarangpur. Rajesh Kumar, 34, had spent the past decade as a taxi driver, logging endless hours behind the wheel of his aging Tata Indica, a compact car commonly used for transport in India. Its worn exterior and creaking suspension bore the marks of years spent navigating this region's rugged, unpaved roads. Each morning, he would wake before sunrise, kiss his sleeping daughters Anjali and Divya goodbye, and head out in search of fares. His wife Priya would pack him a simple lunch of roti and dal, carefully wrapped in newspaper. They couldn't afford proper containers, but Rajesh never complained. He never imagined that his last early morning with his family would come so soon. That May evening had been different from his usual fare runs. A wealthy businessman had hired several taxis, including Rajesh's, to transport guests from his son's wedding. The Maharaja Golden Marriage Hall had been transformed into a scene from a Bollywood movie, with crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, and food served on gold-plated thalas. As Rajesh ferried the final group of guests home, he couldn't help but think of his own simple wedding to Priya 7 years earlier. Just a small ceremony in the local temple, followed by a modest meal. His passengers, still dressed in their expensive silk garments, chatted about the lavish dowry and the bride's diamond jewelry. The setting sun cast long shadows through the sal trees, turning the narrow road into a corridor of flickering golden shadow. As Rajesh drove, he passed occasional signs warning of wildlife crossings, common in this region where human settlements bordered thick forests teeming with life. In recent weeks, villagers had reported an increase in bear sightings. Several farmers had lost livestock, and forestry officials had issued advisories about sloth bears venturing closer to human settlements. Though primarily insectivores, these bears were known to react aggressively when startled, and with the dry season reducing food availability, encounters had become more frequent. But warnings were easy to ignore, until the danger is staring right back at you. And for Rajesh Kumar, that moment was coming fast. Rajesh pulled his taxi over near a small clearing, needing to relieve himself after hours on the road. His passengers, still in their wedding finery, urged him to wait until they reached the next town, but he stepped toward the tree line, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. It was then, as he approached the forest edge, that he spotted it, a massive sloth bear lying near a small pond. What Rajesh didn't realize was that he'd encountered one of Odisha's most lethal predators. Unlike their Himalayan cousins, these sloth bears had adapted to live surprisingly close to human settlements, making them particularly dangerous. Growing up to 6 feet tall when standing and weighing over 300 pounds, they are primarily insectivores, feeding on termites, ants, and fruit. They rarely prey on large animals and typically avoid human interactions. However, when startled or provoked, they can be highly aggressive. Their powerful claws and incredibly strong jaws, capable of crushing coconuts with ease, make them fatal when defending themselves. His passengers shouted for him to hurry back to the taxi, but something possessed Rajesh at that moment. Driven by the desire to take a selfie with the bear, he pulled out his simple phone and stepped closer, ignoring the desperate warnings from his passengers. The attack was quick and brutal. The bear's 5-inch claws tore through Rajesh's chest and abdomen, while its powerful jaws crushed his shoulder and neck. The force of the bear's bite was strong enough to shatter his collarbone and several ribs. His spine was severed in multiple places as the bear shook him violently, and deep lacerations covered much of his body. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time the bear finally released him, Rajesh was already dead. In a remarkable display of nature's complexity, a stray dog that had been sleeping nearby suddenly charged forward, biting at the bear's legs in a desperate attempt to drive it away. The bear, already agitated, turned its fury on the smaller animal, swiping at it with its massive claws. The passengers, still frozen in shock inside the taxi, could do nothing but watch as the brutal attack unfolded. Once the bear moved away from Rajesh to focus on the dog, one of the passengers seized the opportunity to act. They scrambled out of the vehicle and ran back toward the road, flagging down a passing motorcyclist. The rider sped to the nearest village, where locals quickly relayed the news to forest officials stationed at the Nabarangpur Wildlife Division. Nearly an hour later, a response team arrived with tranquilizer rifles. The bear was still lingering near the clearing, pacing and occasionally swiping at the now injured stray dog that continued barking from a distance. The officials fired 3 tranquilizer darts into the animal, waiting until it finally collapsed before approaching. Once the bear was fully sedated, they loaded it onto a transport vehicle to relocate it to a remote section of the forest. Rajesh's body was then recovered. His phone, still clutched tightly in his hand, revealed a cracked screen displaying his final act, a blurred image of an approaching mass of fur and teeth. After the bear was subdued with tranquilizer darts, authorities transported it to a remote forested area, far from human settlements. With the immediate danger contained, officials recovered Rajesh's body and documented the scene before informing his family. In the days that followed, the impact of his death rippled through the community. The wealthy family whose wedding guests he had been driving covered his funeral expenses and established a small fund for his daughter's education. His wife Priya took up work as a seamstress despite her ongoing health concerns, now forced to provide for their children alone. The taxi company forgave the remainder of Rajesh's loan, allowing his family to keep their modest home. Thanks for watching this bear attack compilation. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to check out another video from our channel. It's waiting for you on your end screen right now. See you there.